say we are drugging a generation of children to fit in with the expectations of adults. Others say that ADHD meds have been an absolute lifeline to them. So what is the truth about medicating children with ADHD, and what should you do? Welcome to the SEM Parents Survival Guide podcast. My name is Esther Freeman and I teach parents the principles and techniques that help my daughter go from 5 or 6 violent meltdowns a day to virtually 0. In this weekly podcast, you will learn how to create a calmer family life. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. So the question of whether you should medicate your ADHD child is something that I see coming up quite a lot from parents, especially those who've been recently diagnosed. And it is a question that I have asked myself, and I face the dilemma that you may be facing today. And what I did is I went out and did some research, and I want to share with you what I learned. So hopefully it will help you make a decision that's best for you and your family. So I want to start off with a bit of history because there's been a lot of hysteria, particularly in the media, around this subject. And I think it's useful just to get the facts straight, first of all. So medicating children for concentration and focus is actually nothing new. The first drugs came onto the market in 1937. It's also not true that there are a whole generation of children on drugs now. We did see a particular period between 2007 and 2013, which did see quite a rise, around a 50% rise in prescriptions for children with ADHD. However, since then, it's pretty much sort of leveled off. The increase we're now seeing is around adults with ADHD. And overall, there are actually only 200,000 people in the UK who are using ADHD meds, which is a fraction of the numbers of people with the condition. So those are the facts. Now let's get into some of the arguments for and against. So for some people, taking medication for ADHD has completely changed their life. I mean, there's no denying that for some, the impact of the medication is dramatic and it's also very quick. And some of the benefits are being able to get through a work day or a school day without being distracted every 3 minutes, an increase in confidence. Some people have even said that colours around them seem to be brighter. And there's been an improvement in some cases in family dynamics because of the child's behaviour at home being a little bit easier to handle. And I even heard a case of someone who went on the ADHD meds and it improved their migraines, which is pretty unusual, but that is one benefit. Some people have said that the medication is so helpful that denying it to people with ADHD is like denying a wheelchair to someone with mobility issues. I have to admit, I do find these analogies comparing neurodisabilities with physical disabilities, I find them a bit problematic because it's just not a good comparison. We know so less about the human brain than we do about other types of physical disabilities. And it's also not that black and white. For a start, all medications have side effects and the ADHD meds are no different. Some of the side effects can be loss of appetite, irritability or low mood, and in some cases it can actually cause headaches. It is true though that these side effects seem to be quite rare, but for those who get them, they are very real. It's also the case that these meds just simply don't work for some people, and you're never able to predict who they're going to work for and who they're not, because every brain is different and the drugs will interact with that brain differently. So you have to consider these things. The other thing to think about is when you are giving these drugs to a child. There have been adolescents who have had positive effects of the drugs, but still complained about taking them because they said that they just didn't feel that they were them anymore. It just seemed to change their personality. And at a time in their life when they're going through so many changes, they're working out who they are, building their self-identity, throwing a medication that can be as dramatic as some of these ADHD meds can just add to that confusion. It's also the case that they do not provide a long-term positive benefit. If you stop taking the ADHD meds, the symptoms will simply come back. So they're not a cure, they're just something to manage it. And they also don't deal with some of the issues that can be around ADHD, such as anxiety, relationship problems, and self-knowledge. So I had a little look into some of the advice of some of the leading thinkers in the field. So the first one was NICE, that's the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence, which doesn't really spell nice. I've always wondered why that was spelled nice. But anyway, their advice is that medication is not used immediately. And I'm going to give their quote here. So they say, uncertainty still surrounds the quality of evidence and the balance of risks and benefits of long-term drug use for ADHD in children and young people. So they say don't go immediately to medication. Another person who I looked up was Dr. Gabor Mate. So he's a Canadian physician and he has ADHD himself. His kids have ADHD and he has diagnosed thousands of people over his career with ADHD. And he says that he doesn't think that medication should be your first line of treatment or even the only form of treatment. He says that you need to look at other ways of addressing the issues. And he also is very firm on that the decision on whether to take the drugs or not should be with the child. And I would say this is something that I see missing from a lot of the discussions when people say, should I use medication? The first question should really be, what does your child think? Because Dr. Mate says that if you are forcing a child against their will to take these medications, then this can lead to longer term problems in your relationship with the child. And he says, he warns that it can lead to later life rebellion. When the child reaches adolescence, they'll just absolutely refuse to take them. So you might be able to persuade or trick a younger child into taking them. He talks about someone who was mixing the medication into the child's morning drink at breakfast. And you might be able to get away with that when they're younger, but when they hit adolescence, you're going to hit a brick wall and they may simply refuse to take them. And Gabor Mate warns that you may be setting up a lifetime of resistance against any kind of medication, regardless of how necessary and helpful it might be to the young person. So that's just something to think about. The final point I want to make is that we have faced a crisis in supply of ADHD meds, and this has been a global problem. So they said that supplies would be back on track in the autumn, so that's autumn 2023. And we are now in summer 2024 and they're still not back on track. And so you have to ask yourself, if you are relying only on medication, what are you going to do if you can't get hold of that medication? So I would say to you, whatever you decide, whether you decide to medicate your child or not, in discussion with your child, you need to have a backup plan. And the backup plan that I would advise is a parenting strategy called NVR, which stands for non-violent resistance. And it is a strategy that is built upon the principles and techniques of leading civil rights activists and human rights activists such as Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King. Because they found that when they met violence and aggression with peace and resistance, they actually got further in their struggles and achieved greater wins with that approach than meeting violence with violence. And even people like Nelson Mandela, who had used violence early in his activism days, he later moved to a non-violent resistance approach because he found he got further with it. So the NVR parenting strategy meets peaceful resistance when faced with violence and aggression in the home. And what we find is that when we create this safer environment in the home, a relationship first parenting strategy, then those challenging behaviours do diminish. And there's a couple of pieces of research that have been done into NVR. The first was done in France and was with 82 parents, and they looked at NVR versus clinical strategies such as counselling and psychoeducation. And although immediately after doing the NVR course, there didn't seem to be a benefit of this parenting strategy over these other approaches, what they found was long term, it actually did. So this is a long-term approach. It's not something that you're going to get overnight results with, and it is always a work in progress. But long-term, you can see the benefits. I have been using NVR with my daughter since she was around 4 or 5. She's 11 now. And I have to say, this is a child who went from 5 or 6 violent meltdowns a day. It took me 3 years to get her into school full time. It was an absolute nightmare. This week, she's just gone off on her first school residential. If you had asked me, however many years ago now, 6 years ago, would my child go on a school residential, I would have just laughed in your face. The fact that she can now do that, I put a lot of that down to her amazingness as a human being, but also having used this NVR parenting approach, because I have seen a dramatic drop. Just as I said, creating a safer environment, having a relationship first parenting approach has created a sense of safety in her, which has reduced so many of the problematic behaviours. She will always be a neurodivergent child. She will always struggle with things. She will always have cognitive difficulties and all the rest of it, speech and language difficulties, all the rest of it. But she is now able to do things that would have been unthinkable years ago, and she's never been on medication. My decision in the end was not to medicate. Not saying I might change my mind in the future, might do, but using NVR has had very dramatic results for us. And as I said, even if you do decide to medicate your child, you will need a backup. And the other thing that you need to look at is what's going on in school. Now, Dr. Gabor Mate says that some schools are asking parents to medicate their children. I have to say, I've never heard this in the UK. This is happening in North America, apparently, according to him, but I haven't heard of it over here. But I want to say, if your school has ever said that to you, it is not appropriate, and you should never, ever put a child on medication because a school is requesting it because they want the child to fit in with their systems. The 2010 Equalities Act states that reasonable adjustments must be made for a child or any person with disabilities so that they can access public services. So that includes schools. So you have it enshrined in law that is not your child who needs to change, but the school. Some of the things that you might want to consider is the classroom environment, particularly in a lot of mainstream schools, teachers do love putting stuff all over the walls. In our classroom, it's hanging from the ceiling. It's insane. This is not a great environment for kids with ADHD. And actually, it's interesting, if you go to a special school, you don't see any of this stuff because they know it's distracting and it does not help children learn. Now, you may have a bit of a fight on your hands to get them to take it all off, but maybe you could ask for your child to be seated in a quieter corner with less distractions. You might also ask if they can have regular breaks. My daughter has regular breaks throughout the day, and they're not just playtime breaks, they have to be separate learning breaks where she can go off and just unwind her mind, and she might do some mindful activities like colouring in or painting. Your child will have their interests and things that help calm them down, and you'll know what those are, so you can suggest those to the teacher. So you might also want to think about other parts of the school environment that might be challenging them. For example, at playtimes, do they need additional support at playtimes? And thinking at home about things like sleep and nutrition. It's very easy for us to forget these things, often because they're really hard to deal with. I do appreciate that. But having a healthy diet and regular exercise, not too much exercise. I find if I do too much with my daughter, it actually makes her symptoms worse. But doing some healthy exercise, having some downtime before the end of the day, all these sort of things need to be built into your strategy for helping to manage your child's condition. And so it benefits your family life, it benefits them and the family life, and everyone gets on better. So these are some things to think about when coming to your decision. Unless your child is in absolute crisis, you might want to hold off on the medication and just try some of these strategies first. I'm offering every listener of this podcast a free one-to-one coaching session for 20 minutes to talk through some NVR strategies that might help you in your family life. So if you would like to give this amazing parenting strategy a go, you can go on my website and book in your free 20-minute consultation now. I will put a link to where you can book in the show notes. So I hope that will help you. So as usual, I'm now going to have a little chat about wider things going on in the SEND world. And I was interested this week with election fever going on. How are we finding it all, everyone? So I was interested to see that Ed Davey, who's the leader of the Liberal Democrats, did an interview with ITV where he talked very movingly about his son who is disabled. He doesn't say exactly what his disabilities are, but he does say that he needs round-the-clock care. So I think we can assume they're kind of profound learning disabilities that he's got. And he talked about his fears for the future and what would happen to his son if he died. Because obviously, as he says, that is something that all parents were worried about. But when you have a child with such high care needs, it's just an added burden. And I would encourage you to look up the interview. It's very moving. You can see that he's quite close to tears in it. So I'm not advocating the Lib Dems here. I don't actually support the Lib Dems. I'm not going to say who I do support, but I do think it's quite good that one politician at least is bringing disability into the political debate. And the Lib Dems are actually advocating for free care for older people and disabled people, adult disabled people. So currently it's means tested, and one of their election pledges is that they would make it free to everyone. And regardless of what you think of the Lib Dems or any of the other parties, it is true that they are the only people who are discussing disability now. And there is a live debate on the 7th of June on the BBC with all the party leaders. So we had one last night that was just Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. So on the 7th of June on the BBC, it will be all the main parties. And so it will be interesting to see whether Ed Davey does bring disability into the conversation. I'd really like to see that, because whoever you want to vote for, whatever your political preference is, I think we can all agree that disability should be on the political agenda far more than it is now, because so much of the sector is in absolute crisis and it's just falling apart, and we need to do something about it. So let's see if any of our political leaders can make a commitment to that and start turning things around. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about MVR, you might like this video here. This goes into one of the principles of MVR and gives you a taster for what to expect.